Hello and welcome to this interview, which is part of our series on eating disorders. And I am so pleased to be joined today by Phillipa Hay. She is professor at Western Sydney University. Phillipa, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for asking me.
Eating disorders are a growing health concern, and these complex mental health disorders cause psychological suffering for more and more people worldwide. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic brought significant disruption to our daily lives over the past 2 years. Isolation, anxiety, uncertainty, and so on have had certain effects on people's mental health. How impactful has the pandemic been for people suffering from eating disorders?
Yes, I mean, we were concerned about that right at the beginning of the pandemic. And I know I wrote an editorial with my colleague, Professor Towles, about what might happen at the time. And we were concerned because not only does the pandemic have an effect on people's mental health, as you're outlining in terms of social isolation and stress and anxiety, and that, you know, the major effects of lockdowns that happen throughout the world in terms of people's connections with others and sense of being in control of their lives. But for people with eating disorders, there was an additional impact of food insecurity and food anxiety. There was a lot of media in the beginning of empty supermarket shelves and access to food. And also, if you're living in lockdown, how do you get food? Food needs to be delivered. So that really did impact for people with eating disorders. We don't know if it led to what we call a rise in eating disorders, like an increase in new problems for people with eating disorders, but it's certainly for people who already had difficulties with their eating and a vulnerability to an eating disorder, probably triggered both increased severity of the eating disorder or an onset of new eating disorder symptoms. That's probably what the research is telling us, but alongside COVID, there's been a plethora of studies into all aspects of COVID, and a large number of studies have been done, but very few studies have been done which have really carefully looked at what happened over time or followed people over time or really had a good grasp of the sort of true nature of an increase in numbers for people with eating disorders. We do know, though, that the severity probably impacted and people's access to treatment changed. Most therapies moved to being online, and some of the research is telling us that those types of online treatments have pros and cons for people. People like the increased access and flexibility of them, but that connection with your therapist that you get with a live interview sometimes is just not there with the same level of quality. So there's pros and cons. The rapid introduction of telemedicine perhaps overcame many of the issues regarding access, but again, that's a form of therapy that has its own challenges as well. And I think the other aspect of the COVID epidemic is that we have to listen a bit more to people's experiences, what we call qualitative research. So people actually describing how it was for them during COVID to get a better understanding of, is it that the COVID epidemic actually causes eating disorders? I doubt that we'll find there's a sort of direct link in etiological sense, but certainly it will contribute to a experience of an eating disorder that's more challenging for the person. And alongside all those other effects for people's mental health, we know that people with eating disorders also have a vulnerability to anxiety, to depression, to other mental health disorders. So there's that aspect as well.
Let's hope that this pandemic now comes to an end and we have a return back to normal. Another question is related to appearance-related social media behaviors. They may be indicative of eating disorder risk. Do you think the companies that are providing these social media platforms are doing enough to protect their users? And what should be done in your view to ensure that social media use does not cause a risk to users' mental health?
Well, before the advent of social media, I was often asked, is it the media's fault that we have eating disorders? And it's not the media's fault that we have eating disorders, and it's not social media's fault that we have eating disorders, but that medium really intensifies people's awareness of their body image and of evaluating and critiquing body image and appearance and comparing with others. So social media platforms do have a potential for an adverse effect, for sure. And for young people who are vulnerable, who are using social media platforms a lot and using them where they may be comparing themselves and critiquing themselves, that will intensify anxiety, concern about body image, about weight and shape issues, which often is the sort of pathway into disordered eating behaviors in order to manage that. And so there is a relationship. Whether companies are doing enough, probably not. Perhaps they could never do enough. And we can't go back though. We can't ban Instagram. We can't get rid of social media. And social media has some positive things. It keeps young people connected, certainly in the time of the pandemic. It helped keep people connected, having the internet and being able to FaceTime friends, family, people you're not able to see. So social media in itself is not an evil thing, but it can have adverse impacts and impacts that people don't really think about before the platforms go up. So I think companies are trying to do things. I think young people as well are becoming more media savvy, more aware of media. And we know that media literacy programs and introducing young people to the concept of photoshopping and how media can misrepresent things and how images change and you can blush out blemishes in people's faces, etc. I think young people are becoming much more aware of these aspects of media, and that really gives them sort of the information to be able to judge themselves about what's happening out there in the media and on social media platforms. And oh, she just sort of photoshopped, or he just photoshopped himself, and that's probably why he looks so much better than I do, and why no one else seems to have any facial blemishes. It's because they can be, photoshopped out. So I think that's the other key. We know that media literacy and really being media smart, and we have some programs in Australia here, media smart programs, we know they can make a difference. We know they can decrease young people's risk of developing an eating disorder and other disordered eating behaviors. So that's the other side of the coin, is for everyone to become more media smart and to use social media in media savvy ways, if you like, or clever ways, or so strengthen the user as much as also advocating to the provider to be more careful about what they allow and what they have on their platforms.
We have seen a worldwide increase in disordered eating in recent years, but apart from the increasing use of social media, what other factors may be driving this trend, and what could we do to reverse it?
Yeah, so a couple of years back, I did a very interesting review where I was asked to look at the relationship between urbanicity, or living in cities, and eating disorders. And what I found was, in fact, there isn't a relationship between an urban setting in particular or a rural setting in particular, but there are aspects of where people live, aspects of the environment, which appear to increase people's risk of disordered eating and eating disorders. So one thing that really struck out was one study that came from Europe, which was that people who live in spaces where there's lots of blue or lots of water, if you like, and lots of green or lots of vegetation and forest, that seems to be protected for an eating disorder. So if we can change our cities to be more, have more environmentally friendly places, more green spaces, more waterfalls, water features, etc. And if we can change our rural environments also to be like that, that's what matters. It's not where you live, it's how you can create the environment around you. And we often do associate pleasant environments with rural environments, but in fact, not all rural environments or remote environments are pleasant in that way. And we have some very remote areas in Australia which do not have a lot of green or a lot of blue, and maybe, making people who live in those environments also bringing them access to pleasant places to live in makes a difference. But the other thing that came out of that was often that move to an urban environment leads to a loss of traditional ways of eating and relating to people while you're eating. And I have a student at the moment working in Fiji, and there was actually a positive effect of the COVID pandemic for some of the aspects of food and eating in Fiji during the COVID pandemic, because people reverted to traditional ways of eating. They ate at home more, they ate less takeaway, and they ate more traditional foods like fish and things that they grew in their gardens, and had a more sort of positive relationship with food, eating, family life that they noticed that sort of re-emerged during the pandemic. So that's an important aspect, I think. Loss of traditional ways of eating, loss of family meals, sharing food in a very positive way with your family, the people you live around, and eating a range of variety of foods that are the sort of healthy foods, or foods that promote well-being, I guess, in a sense, rather than foods which are often associated with food insecurity. And what we see, and this again in the pandemic, we saw a lot of food insecurity, and we know that that's also associated with a risk for disordered eating. And when people are living in an environment of food insecurity, they maybe have very poor access to good quality foods, good quality ways of eating. Their access to what I call junk foods or poor quality foods is good, but access to good quality foods is not there. So those are factors, I think, which have been acting probably in our cultures, with the sort of shift to perhaps less environments which are less supportive for people in terms of their mental well-being, their mental health, and relating to food and eating and family life. A rise in sort of food insecurity and poverty in some of the large urban centres around the world. And I guess alongside that, we have a society that has an extreme concern about weight and shape. So if you ask anybody in our society if they're worried about their weight, have you ever been on a diet, it's almost 100%. It must be almost 99.9% of people. So we have a society that has this investment or this high valuation of a certain weight and shape, physique, being healthy, being slender, being fit, being muscular for young men. So combine that with changes to patterns of food and eating, and a sort of increase in access to poor quality foods, if you like, as well. Combine those things together, I think we can understand that perhaps this is somewhere towards explaining a rise in disordered eating in our communities.
There were also recent reports that disordered eating behaviors were greater in those with diabetes. Can you tell us a bit more about how eating disorders may be connected to diabetes, or the other way around?
Yeah, I mean, eating disorders don't cause diabetes, and diabetes in itself doesn't cause eating disorders. But for someone with a vulnerability to an eating disorder and to weight and shape concerns who develops diabetes, the management or the treatment for the diabetes often is associated with weight gain, and they may therefore get anxious about that, or may start not using the insulin in the way that they should be using it because of that fear and anxiety about weight gain. And combined with manipulation of the insulin and the diabetes being under poor control, and then people getting angry with them about that, so they then hide that behavior, we have a phenomenon called diabulimia, which is that combination of concerns about weight and shape, fear about weight change with the management of the diabetes, and then not engaging as well as they should be in the care for their diabetes. So the diabetes is getting worse. They're not feeling good about that. They're not feeling well in themselves physically or mentally. And they may also develop other disordered eating behaviors to also try and keep their weight down as well. And that's going to be a pathway into eating disorders such as bulimia nervosa and anorexia nervosa for young people with diabetes. So there is a relationship. As I say, they're not directly causing each other, but when they're happening together, then each gets worse. And we know that the physical and mental health impacts are worse and higher for people who have both diabetes and an eating disorder.
Last question. Can you also share with us the focus of your current research and what you aim to achieve next in your work?
I've done a lot of research in what we call the distribution and determinants of eating disorders, and I've talked about that a little bit in terms of studying the prevalence of eating disorders across time and across space. But my real passion is in understanding treatments better and understanding how treatments can be better received by people and work better for people. We have quite a lot of treatments which we call evidence-based treatments in eating disorders. We know that they work in randomized controlled trials, but we know that out there in the real world, there's a big gap between the people who have eating disorders and the people who are receiving treatment and also doing well in that treatment, getting better in that treatment and coming out the other side. And there are still, unfortunately, many people who enter treatments for eating disorders and don't get better and remain unwell for many years. So my real interest is in closing that treatment gap and in research that listens to people's treatment experiences and tries to work out how treatments could work better for them. And we have, I'm involved in an evaluation of a new program in Australia, which is much more led by people with lived experience. And it's a very interesting program where, in fact, when people apply for a position at the program, they're asked, have they had a lived experience of an eating disorder? And that is a positive attribute that's seen as a tick, if you like, not as something to be worried about or concerned about. So perhaps programs where there are more people who have themselves experienced an eating disorder, programs that are more respectful of people, more collaborative. We know that one thing that keeps people away from seeking treatment is often a fear of being forced into treatment or forced into treatments that they find distressing or cause a great deal of anxiety for them and forced into them under the Mental Health Act, or under legislation, for example. So we know there's that anxiety and we know that people may then avoid. So this program really sets out to be very collaborative, very welcoming of people and using the expertise and the skills of people with lived experience as part of the actual program. I think the other aspect of that is offering people choices. So people with eating disorders very often have experienced treatments where they're told there's no choice. This is the treatment that works. This is what you're going to have. And there's no choice in that. And there's nothing less engaging, I think, than offering people treatments for which there is no choice. So I think we need to learn a lot more about how to engage people in treatment, how to offer people treatments where there are true choices within that treatment and alternatives, so that if a treatment is not working for the person, we sit back and we talk to them about how they can really rethink what's happening here, what treatments might work, what might work better for them, what stage they're at. Maybe something's not working now might work later, or something that's working well now, continue with that at the time. But having choices about it and more flexibility, more respectful care and more collaborative care and more care that involves peer workers and people with lived experience. And I suppose my interest, because I'm an academic, is in evaluating that, seeing does that work, is that making a difference?
Great. Phillipa, thank you so much for all your answers and your time, and best of luck with your further work. Thank you.
Thank you.